There we go. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Walter Herring, who will do our formal introduction, and then we'll get started with our speaker.
Thank you, Shannon, and hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Walter Herring. I'm a PhD student in the Education Policy program here at UVA. Before we got started, I did want to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize the tragic events that unfolded at NRG Park in Houston over this past weekend. As a group that's devoted and a community that's devoted to improving the lives of young people, we mourn the young lives that were lost there and those that suffered injuries and trauma at the event. And our heart goes out to the victims and to their families and to the city of Houston as it recovers from that tragedy. With that, I welcome you all to our seminar today. This talk is part of the Education Policy Works seminar series sponsored by the Bankard Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, Ed Policy Works hosts a number of talks from external and sometimes internal speakers on a host of education policy and research-related topics. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Dora Dembski on November 22nd. For more information on our center at Policy Works or the next seminar, please visit us. Please visit our website. Today, though, we're very excited to virtually welcome Dr. Ruth López Turley. Dr. Turley joins us from beautiful Rice University in the heart of Houston, Texas. It turns out that we here at EPW actually have a few connections to Rice, one notable and one not so notable. On the notable side, one of our postdocs, Laura Bellows, received her BA from Rice. On the less notable side, I spent one sweltering summer in the dorms of Rice University while I was teaching summer school in Houston ISD. So this is to say that the Rice to Ed Policy Works pipeline is perhaps stronger than people give it credit for. For those of us that aspire to have our research influence policy or practice, Dr. Turley's work, I think, serves as an excellent exemplar for how to bring those desires to fruition. Dr. Turley founded and directs the Houston Education Research Consortium, which is a research practice partnership between Rice and 11 Houston area school districts that aims to improve educational equity in the area. She also founded the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships, which supports almost 40 partnerships between research institutions and education agencies throughout the country. She served in numerous elected and appointed positions with the American Educational Research Association and the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness and the National Academies, just to name a few. Dr. Turley today will be talking for approximately 1 hour and we'll leave about 20 minutes for discussion and questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 1:30 p.m. can be addressed via email as other meetings will begin at that time. Again, thank you all for virtually attending the Education Policy Seminar series today and join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth López Turley.
Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all, even though it is by Zoom and not in person as we had originally hoped. I was really looking forward to my first visit to UVA. I don't think I've been to that campus before, so I was looking forward to that. I'm saying that because I hope to do that still at some point. I would love to go and visit in person. And Walter, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I had no idea that you had spent some time here. And I'm glad that you mentioned HISD in particular, the Houston Independent School District, because we work with them very closely. And but who told you to come during the summer? They gave you bad information.
I didn't have a choice. Yeah, that was not my decision. But I did grow up in Dallas, so humidity was nothing new.
It's okay then. Yeah, the best time to visit Houston is right now. It's beautiful, cool, and sunny weather, and it's the perfect time to be here. I spent the entire weekend outdoors at a baseball tournament for my son, so this is a great time to be here. Walter, also thank you for noting the unfortunate tragedy on Friday here in Houston. One of my sons is in high school and is friends of friends who one of those that passed away, actually a 14-year-old, the youngest one to pass away in that tragedy. So I do appreciate you noting that and mentioning that. And frankly, it is relevant to what we are going to talk about today, not only because of what you mentioned, that we all care deeply about our youth, and we want to do everything in our power to make things better for them always, but also because of the fact that I want to talk today about how we can best inform school districts during times of crisis. And it just seems like it's funny that the title almost makes it sound like crises happen once in a while, or maybe they're just occasional. They happen in occasional times, but that's unfortunately not the case. It seems like for many school districts, it's just one crisis after another. And we have to really understand that. I think as researchers, we know that, we're aware of that, but to really truly understand that in a way that informs how we do our work as researchers to make it much more likely that we can actually inform their decision making, even when things are going crazy and they don't necessarily, they meaning school districts, school district leaders, don't necessarily have the time to sit down with us and talk about research. And yet those are the moments that we want the research to inform what is going on, precisely because they're experiencing these crises. So that's what I want to talk about with you all today. As Shannon mentioned, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. I welcome interruptions because I want this to be more of a conversation rather than a one-way type of presentation. But because I can't see everyone simultaneously, it is helpful to me if you interrupt me. But if I don't see you or calling you, or if you put something in the chat, Shannon will help me out with that. Where this comes from, so Walter mentioned that I founded HERC, the Houston Education Research Consortium, about 10 years ago. And the reason, so I want to give a little bit of background about what led to me coming to Rice and founding this research practice partnership. Because when I'm in your shoes listening to someone else speak, I know that everybody has a story for why they do what they do. And I'm always curious. I want to hear just at least a little bit about, so why do you do what you do? Because there's always a story. And I'll use it as a way to introduce the things that I've learned over the past decade of really focusing on this type of research. So I started off my career doing research in the way that I think most of us today are still trained to do research. And the reason why I went into this line of work, specifically in education, in my case, the sociology of education, the reason why I went into that line of work is because in all honesty, I wanted to change the world. I was very frustrated with a lot of things that I saw growing up in my hometown of Laredo, Texas. My family's from Mexico. I grew up on the US-Mexico border in a bilingual, bicultural community with many wonderful things happening along the border, but also many huge challenges happening along the border with child poverty rates that are still extremely high. And I was among those children, grew up in a very poor context. My mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 3rd grade education. Things were hard at home. And there's no softer way to put that. Like, things were very challenging at home. And in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, and the things that I saw from a very early age, even though I, of course, didn't have the vocabulary for it, I knew early on that there's a lot of injustice to go around, and that the people that face the brunt of those injustices often are people that have a very low education level. They're the people that seem to suffer the most when it comes to these injustices. So that got me really focused on education. I was like, okay, that's the ticket. That's the way out of poverty. That's the way out of having to face all these injustices. Because I was surrounded by people that were working really, really hard for very, very little. And I was like, that's just wrong. How can we change this? And it always seemed to go back to education. So I was very, very lucky. Yes, I worked hard and all that stuff, but I know that unfortunately that's not enough. That for most people that work hard and get good grades and do all the things that they're supposed to do, that's not enough. And for me, I was very lucky in that the right people came into my life at the right time with the right information that I needed about financial aid, about all those things, because I thought I wasn't going to college. But the people that informed me and I made it possible for me to go to college. That's exactly why I was like, okay, I'm going to go into research. I'm going to change the world. And then I discovered that I was wrong. I was absolutely wrong about research. And hang in there with me, because for those of you that are like training to be researchers right now, I don't mean to burst your bubble and tell you you're in the wrong line of work, but rather just to point out that I was wrong that research mattered, but that research can matter, but only if you make a very, very explicit effort to make it matter. That's the part that I didn't really learn when I was in grad school, like how to make it matter, how to make it connect in a way that really has an impact on the world. So I had to change the way I did research in a pretty dramatic way. And that's what I want to share with you all today, especially in light of all these crises that seem to be happening around us, perhaps even more frequently than before, and in an effort to really inform school districts in my case, but I know that some of you work at other levels as well. And so hopefully these principles will apply there too. So the main three things that I want to cover today, that I want to really kind of dive into, that these are the key ingredients that I have found over the last 10 years to be really, really important in terms of actually informing our school district partners. The first is simply that in order to truly inform, especially in times of crisis, we have to have a pre-existing partnership, meaning that we can't try to set things up while things are going crazy. There's just no way that anyone is going to pay attention to us, nor should they, right? They're putting out fires. There's no time to be setting up anything in terms of any collaboration, any data sharing, anything along those lines. All of it has to be set up long before anything goes wrong. And it has to be set up in a really clear manner, that where it's like it's a standing structure, an infrastructure that you're using all the time. That way, everything is a well-oiled machine, as they say, so that you can really depend on it and use it as a means of communication and getting things done when the world seems to be falling apart. The second piece that I will be talking about today is responsive research, which is quite different from the way we academics normally do research, or at least it's quite different from the way I was taught to do research. But this is referring to research that truly aims to respond to our district partners' needs and to respond to whatever is happening in the world in that moment that needs to be addressed most urgently. And that can be very challenging, because what it really means is that we have to have a willingness to stop everything that we're doing, interrupt everything that we're doing, put research projects aside in order to pick up these emergency projects that will aim to address really urgent things that are needed. And that's hard to do, because as researchers, we put so much time and money and effort into setting up our projects. The last thing we want to do is throw it all out the window and start all over again with something. And frankly, that is the kind of task that is needed in order to truly be responsive. And then the last thing that I want to talk about today is funding, and especially what I would call flexible funding that allows us to do responsive research, because you can't just throw projects out the window that are funded, right, where you've got funders that you've promised, right, you're going to do this work during this time period, and now that a crisis has happened, you're supposed to throw it all out the window and do something else. You need a very special kind of funding in order to allow that to happen. And I'm going to aim to make this as practical as possible, because I recognize that each of these three things that I'm talking about are extremely challenging to do. But I'm going to try to give you some examples of things that I've done, and some things that I think will help if there are any of you that are interested in really diving into this kind of work, or maybe you're already doing this kind of work. I would especially love for you to also share what you have found to work. Or if you're really bold and brave, also share what you have found to not work, so that we can learn from your mistakes. We always love sharing. I shouldn't say I love sharing it, but I do share about my mistakes, because I think that some of the greatest lessons that I've learned are from terrible, terrible mistakes. And I've made many of them. So that's where we're going today. So first, I just want to talk about this realization that maybe to some of you is like obvious and common sense, but to me, it took me a while to really genuinely recognize a disconnect between researchers on the one hand, in particular academic researchers, like many of us in this virtual room, but also the disconnect between, so the researchers on the one hand and districts and district leaders on the other hand. And the first thing that I had to learn is to really realize that school districts actually collect massive amounts of data, huge amounts of data, but they have very limited research capacity. And even though I know that there are a lot of districts out there that do have their own in-house research departments, but usually those are only the largest school districts that happen to have researchers in their in-house. Usually though, they're very small research teams. And there are many, many districts, especially the smaller districts, that have zero researchers. And yet they, like I said, they have to, by law, they have to collect a lot of data. And just to give you one example that is shown in this graph from HISD, the Houston Independent School District, they have, like, since 2007, they've amassed thousands, actually tens of thousands of variables for over 600,000 students. Their enrollment is around 200,000 students. They're the largest school district in the state of Texas, and about the 7th largest in the country. But if you focus on like all the students that have spent any amount of time in the school district at any point in time, that it comes out to be about 600,000 students. So tens of thousands of variables for 600,000 students, that adds up to, over 32 billion data points, right? And so they're sitting, when I say they're sitting on massive amounts of data, I mean, like, they're sitting on massive amounts of data, and they have very, very limited research capacity. Like I just mentioned, there are many cases where the research capacity is actually zero, right? So very, very clear need that I have to admit I didn't fully appreciate until about 10 years ago, which is pretty naive, I think, in retrospect, but there it is. So there's that clear need on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we've got universities like Rice and many others, especially those that focus on research, that have unparalleled research capacity, but rarely inform school districts directly. And I mean directly. That's the key word here. And that I think there are a lot of efforts out there to inform, but they're usually not trying to inform directly. Instead, that's why I have this photo here. The main activity of research universities is to produce research that ends up in journals like this, academic journals. That's the way I was trained. That's the way I think many of us are still trained to this day. That's our goal. Like the whole academic endeavor is set up in this manner, and it creates some challenges, because then the academic research that is produced does not really truly reach district leaders that could potentially use it. And what I tend to hear from district leaders are things like, first of all, academic research is often, not always, but often irrelevant. It's irrelevant. It has very little to do with what is going on at our school districts. It has very little to do with our priorities, our needs, our interests, because it's done independently. So it's often irrelevant. It's also often inapplicable in the sense that it's either not about our particular students or our particular context, but also it's often outdated. And in the sense that the publication process, the academic publication process, takes so long that by the time research is actually out there and published, it's usually about, like, they use data that are 5-10 years old, sometimes even longer, right? But even if let's take a best case scenario where the research is produced, and by the time it's published, the data that it's referring to are only 5 years old. Even if we take that best case scenario for a school district, that's outdated. That's really outdated. They move so fast that often, just last year, if you compare what's going on this year to last year or the year before, huge differences. The student body has changed, policies have changed, everything has changed. And if you're reporting results that are 5 years old, they're like, well, a lot has changed since then. So it's kind of it's no longer applicable. They move very fast. Another common thing that I hear from our district partners is that academic research is just it's just inaccessible in two ways. One is just the way we write, the way we share our research. It's really aiming to inform other academics. It's not really aiming to inform them, or district leaders, or whoever the potential users of your research are that you want to aim for. It's not truly aimed for them. So it's in an inaccessible language format. And frankly, many times it's literally inaccessible in that they don't have access to our journals. Like our institutions pay thousands of dollars for us to have access to journals. And for a lot of school districts, that's just a luxury they can't afford. And they literally don't have access to all of the academic publications that we have access to. But let's say, even again, the best case scenario, let's say they do have access to, it's not really written for them, and they don't have the time to sit down and read 30-page manuscripts and all that stuff. And sometimes we don't have that time either, frankly. But then the last thing that I want to say is that they also share with me that academic research is often just unactionable. There's not much they can do about the kinds of things, and I'll pick on my own discipline, sociologists in particular. They'll say, like, oh, the kinds of conclusions that you all draw, and you talk about, like, oh, all these things that we're observing are due to poverty, or they're due to, and what do you expect us to do as school districts to do about that? There's very little we can do. There are things they can do, don't get me wrong, but often we're really emphasizing things that are beyond the scope of what they have authority to change. So we have to think about all of these things. Like like I said, we have this disconnect. We have districts with lots of data, but very little research capacity. And then we have research universities with a lot of research capacity, but they're not directly connected to each other. So when I've talked to our district partners, I hear from district leaders and I ask them, when do you use research? How do you decide when to use research and which research do you use? And these are people that I've developed relationships with. And I can please be honest with me, tell me, I want to know, this is really important information for me and my fellow academic researchers. And the very first thing that I hear, and this is not from a single person, but I've heard this repeatedly, is that they need to know and trust the researchers. I was very surprised, I have to admit, the first time I heard this, because I realized that I was expecting a response like, they have to indicate that they know their stuff, right? Maybe it has to be published in a prestigious academic journal, or maybe the researcher has to be from a prestigious institution or something like that. No, that's not what really matters. From their perspective, they just need to know them. They need to feel like they can trust them. Are they really looking out for what's best for our students, or are they just looking for another publication? What is, and I feel like, I need to know them. I need to know that they know us and that they know our students and that they know our situation. Then I'm more likely to use their research. They've also said that they're much more likely to use research if they've actually played a role in developing the research questions. They don't want people to come to them as an afterthought. They're like, no, this has to be something where they're really proactive. They come to us and we've played a role in developing the questions. We've played a role in planning how to use the research long before the research is even started. Let's make a plan for how will this be used? What are the goals here? What are we trying to accomplish? Do they communicate frequently with us? And this was something that was very hard for me at first, because I was like, I don't want to bother them. They're really busy people. And it turns out that, well, they don't want to, of course, busy people don't want to be bothered. Nobody wants to be bothered by something that seems irrelevant or unactionable, or all the things that I mentioned in the previous slide, but rather if it's something that is absolutely of interest to them and that they've been consulted all along, absolutely they want to hear from you, and frequently, and they'll make time for you. Even the busiest people will make time for you if they're genuinely interested. And then of course they want to receive the results in a manner that is really helpful to them. They want to receive the results directly. They want to be able to talk about them with you. They want to receive it in a customized format and in a timely manner. And of course, all of this is extremely challenging to do if we follow the more traditional academic research model. So I want to talk a little bit about that academic research model that I've alluded to, that this is how I've been trained. And I would love to hear from you all about, how you all are training researchers, or if you're a researcher in training, how you are being trained right now, and some of the things that you think are going really well, that are really useful, and some of the things that you think, well, I think this needs to be altered. So I don't know, this has nothing to do with UVA specifically, but I'll just say it this way, this is about how I was trained, and how I realized that wasn't really effective for the kind of impact that I wanted to have. So I was trained that as a researcher, I'm the expert and I develop the research questions, and that I would choose the research site based on the questions, right? You develop the question first and everything follows from that. Think about your basic research methods courses. You do that and then you choose a site based on the research question. Now, often we choose sites based on convenience, but we need to have some sort of a justification regardless. And we also then set up some sort of a short-term collaboration with, in education research, with a specific school or school district or some education agency or something, but we set up a short-term collaboration for the purposes of that research project. And then anything that we produce aims to inform other academics, right? Because of this publication goal that is always front and center. However, with HERC, what we have done is we've really focused on a partnership research model where, by the way, I didn't develop this myself. This is like from lots of colleagues all over the country thinking through like, okay, how can we make research more impactful? And if you'll notice, it's very different. It's like the opposite of the academic research model, where the research questions are jointly developed, where instead of choosing a site based on the research questions, it's the other way around, where you choose questions based on the site, right? You focus on a particular site, a particular locality, and you're going to develop questions based on what is happening there, what the needs are there. And we aim to have a long-term collaboration. I mentioned earlier, we've been in partnership for over 10 years now. It's not a project-specific collaboration. This is very long-term. We know we're not going to solve any of these problems with a single research study. And so the aim here is to really be in a long-term collaboration. And our goal is to inform decision makers first and foremost. We still do work on the academic publications, but frankly, our priority is not that. Our priority is to inform decision makers first. And I do see a few hands up, and I don't know who raised their hand first, but does somebody want to take the lead?
We'll go with Luke.
Yeah, let me jump in. So Ruth, so this is the kind of work, this is the space in which I do my work. So this is all resonating with me. And I raised my hand before you got to some of your final points here, which where you said that you are not producing academic journal articles. You're still doing that, but it's not it's not your first goal.
That's right.
So these two models are sort of the stereotypical models, but I feel unless we're going to completely change the way academic institutions set up their incentives for faculty, where we do our work in this space is more of a hybrid. And I feel like everything nowadays, if it's cool, it's got to be hybrid. Hybrid cars, hybrid this, hybrid that, right? I bought a hybrid mattress recently. But that it is, that in my own work, we are using the quick turnaround stuff that we are producing to directly respond to the needs of our partners in a more timely fashion, to then sort of inform larger research papers, which we hope will still be useful to them, but that the goal of the main target of those research products are more of an academic audience rather than a practitioner audience, which is where we focus on our research briefs.
Thank you, Luke, for that comment. And I think you're absolutely right that we can't just ignore the academic model entirely, because we are in an academic institution. And that's especially a concern to me because I have students. And I don't want to hurt their careers. I want to, in fact, I think, in all honesty, I think their careers are much, much better off because of this experience. But I have to recognize that not all institutions acknowledge that kind of experience or don't give it the same weight. And actually, I think they should give it more weight, but that's my bias there. So you're right that we have to do some sort of a hybrid. Having said that, you also mentioned that we're not necessarily trying to change institutions, or maybe we should. I don't remember exactly how you said it, but I will say that
that's more of a battle I'm not prepared to fight on my own yet.
Got it. Yeah, because it's much bigger than any one person. You're absolutely right. That's a huge battle, but it is one that I have gotten involved in. And I do encourage others to get involved in it, but I'm mostly talking to tenured faculty, that then you can get involved in something like that without risking your job. So for those of you in those situations, I think it's a worthy cause to try to encourage at least our home institutions, to encourage them to acknowledge this work. Sometimes they put this under like volunteer work or service. This is research.
Community engaged is a phrase that we hear here sometimes. Yes. From certain people.
Yes, and I would say, no, this is true research. This is rigorous. This is all of that, and if anything, like I said, I think it's even better than research produced in the more traditional academic model. Therefore, it needs to be treated and rewarded in that way. But that's a much bigger battle. But I do encourage those of you that are in certain positions to address that as much as you can. I do see another hand.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much. This is really exciting stuff. And you've already sort of kind of touched a little bit on my question, which is just, I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you kind of envision folks at different sort of stages of their training or careers being involved with partnership work, so doctoral students, junior faculty, et cetera, because I do see, just challenges, right, for junior folks, and particularly for students in setting up these partnerships themselves, right, could be a big challenge and can come with risks. And so, yeah, just curious how you kind of operationalize that in your context.
Great question, Beth. Yeah, absolutely. I do think I think there's room for everyone to be involved, regardless of their stage, but not the same kind of involvement. So I would absolutely not recommend someone pre-tenure to start a research practice partnership or anything. For me, this was my first post-tenure project. Yeah, I would not recommend that. However, if you happen to be at an institution that already has something like this set up, and it can be great because they have the data sharing agreements in place. They have like all these things set up for you that you can just like dive in and take advantage of the work done for you to get you started, and hopefully it speeds up your timeline, research timeline, and all of that. So I think it can be a great experience for people, grad students, actually not grad students, undergrads. Starting with undergrads, we have undergraduate research assistants all the way on up. But no, I wouldn't recommend you actually starting something like this or directing something like this, like taking on some big leadership role until after you have tenure. That's a great question. So let me tell you a little bit about HERC. And this map shows our 11 district partners. HERC was founded in 2011. Our original district partner was just Houston ISD, but now we have these other district partners as well. And we purposely focused on school districts sharing a border with Houston ISD precisely because we wanted to take on some regional research in addition to district-specific research. You can imagine things like student mobility or teacher job markets, all these, they're not district specific, but rather they're regional issues. These are our 11 district partners represent over 700,000 students in the Houston area, most of whom are economically disadvantaged. HERC is housed within the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice. We now have, HERC has about 25 full-time staff, plus our student research assistants, plus some liaisons that work. They're employees of our school district partners, but they're paid by us. So that's a really key, really important job that has revolutionized our partnership by having people, we have insiders essentially, and that's extremely, extremely important. We have MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding, and data sharing agreements with each of these districts. So we have access to a lot of data, student level data, school level data, etc. We produce a lot of research briefs. This year alone, we have completed 27 research projects. There's a lot of work that we are doing on a range of topics. But I mention all of this because what we have learned is that in order to function, in order to actually be able to inform district partners in times of crisis, all of this that I just mentioned has to be pre-existing, already set up, ready to go. Like, we're already doing all this work, but then when crises come up, we don't have to start from scratch. We're just ready to dive in and address the crisis at hand. That is absolutely key. If you don't have a pre-existing infrastructure, something, I'm not saying it has to look exactly like this, obviously, but something along these lines. If you don't have that, there's no way. When crises hit, the last thing district leaders want to do is sit down and talk to a researcher. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I don't think I'm exaggerating too much when I say that. So only through a pre-existing partnership can researchers be ready to respond when crises hit. And oh, I forgot to show, this is just an example, a cover of one of our research briefs. So you'll see they don't look anything like academic articles. It's totally like easy to read, 3 to 5 pages long. You know, the main findings up front, main implications, that's it. And we don't just hand them over. We have lots of meetings to discuss them long before they happen. And then of course, after they're done, then we have further discussions about what will be done with this information, because our main goal is that we don't want them to sit on shelves. That's our greatest fear. So the next thing I want to talk about is just how we do responsive research, and how we've learned about this infrastructure and how it could be really, really useful when crises hit. The first time we really learned this was in 2017 when Hurricane Harvey hit Houston. It was August of 2017, right before the school year began, or right before it was supposed to begin. And Hurricane Harvey dropped 40 inches of rain in just 4 days. So a lot of Houston flooded. A lot of our schools looked like that photo. And flood damage was estimated at like $125 billion. It was a huge catastrophe. And it turns out that at first, it didn't even occur to me to do research in that moment. Like, all I could think of was, oh, my street is a river. Like, we're just trying to, deal with basics here. And of course, we needed a couple of days to just deal with basics. And I thought, what can I do to be useful? And the only thing I could think of, in all honesty, was like, oh, I need to do laundry for the neighbors in several blocks down whose homes flooded, to try to save all their belongings and their possessions. So that's what I did for the first several times. I was just doing laundry. And then I realized I'm a researcher. Like, we can use research to help in this situation. And so we called a special meeting by Zoom. By the way, this was long before Zoom was popular. But many people's homes were flooded and they couldn't actually get to their offices, even if they weren't flooded, because our streets were rivers. And so we held a Zoom meeting and with our district partners, and asked them, what do you need right now? How can we help as researchers? And they said they really needed to know which students' homes were affected by flooding, what was the extent of flooding. They need to be identified. They need to be able to identify the students and where they were affected. And it turns out that I had just hired, right before this happened, I had just hired a geospatial analyst. And we got really lucky. So we had just hired a geospatial analyst who produced 272 maps, just like this one. I do ask that you do not take any screenshots of this, because what I'm sharing right now is confidential information. But I just wanted to share a quick visual, an example, just so you can see how important we overlaid our student information with FEMA flood maps. And for each school zone showed which parcels had students living in them. As you can see, the ones that are outlined in blue, those are student homes. And then you could see which ones were affected by the flood and even the extent of the damage. And all of this is linked to student data. So because we already had access to student data, we already had all the student information in place, it was just a matter of merging it with FEMA flood maps and then creating these maps and sending them out to our district partners. And in order to do this, like I said earlier, we had to literally stop everything. We had already stopped everything we were doing anyway, because we were dealing with massive flooding. But we put, all our research, once we were able to resume work, we put all our research projects on hold and just focused on getting this done ASAP. So this is an example of responsive research. And then, of course, this next example, you all are also familiar with, because it's affected everybody. When COVID-19 hit, the district focused on meeting students' basic needs, because obviously everything shut down. And for many students, like, schools is where they get their meals, is where they get a lot of resources. And we just focused on how to help the district meet student needs. So HISD, right before the pandemic hit, they had just administered a student survey to 53,000 students about their needs of different kinds. And they asked HERC to analyze it. And we produced graphs like this one for each of their campuses, and showing, health needs, needs at home, emotional needs, and educational needs. And you can see the kinds of needs that were covered in each category, like being able to see a doctor or a dentist or an eye doctor. Like, can students actually do that? And this is one campus example, an actual campus, where you can see the extent of need, which was pretty high. And interestingly, one of the questions under educational needs was whether they had access to a computer and internet service. And this was right before the pandemic hit. It was perfect that they had already asked this question. We had all the data, and we were able to then do some analyses that would zoom in on this, focus on this. This is information that they need, like, right now, in order to be able to address it alongside these other needs as well. And we also provided some information, district-wide information, and this is just to give you a sense of the extent of need. 1 in 4 families said that they were unable to visit an eye doctor annually, which, as you all know, for education, like, they might seem like, oh, an eye doctor is not that big of a deal, not that important. It's huge in education, right? When you can't see, you can't learn very well. Home needs, we found that 1 in 4 students said that they were sometimes hungry for lack of food at home. And in terms of emotional needs, we found that 1 in 4 students said that they often feel sad, lonely, or anxious. I mean, these are all, we were maybe not, I shouldn't say surprised, but that students had these needs, but that we were like, wow, the extent of needs are huge. And this was pre-pandemic. So we had a baseline and then repeated these questions so that we could see what was happening during the pandemic, and then so that we could gauge progress in terms of meeting those needs. So one of the really cool things that we were able to do is, again, as a request from our district partners during the crisis, they asked if we could produce an interactive map that would show each campus the types of needs and extent of needs at each given campus and connect that to service providers in those areas. And then, so that people, whether service providers or parents or school personnel, everybody could go and use these interactive maps. Either they're on the side of having to need some of these services, or if they're on the side of being able to provide these services. And a real highlight for me was that we were able to have a Zoom meeting with the superintendent and 60 funders in the Houston area who all said, we want to help. And we were able to provide this information to try to help the district raise money to meet those needs, and also providing the information to facilitate that happening, the actual meeting of those needs. So very, very exciting. I'm going to skip this slide, and I'm going to go right into, because I was going to give you another example of responsive research, but we can skip it, because I want to talk about the funding piece, because I'm sure a lot of you are wondering about that. Because this is another really hard one. Our funding comes from primarily local funders, these two local funders, but we also receive funding from more national level funders, including like NSF and folks like that. But I want to zoom in on these folks because the thing that has really, really helped us to be able to do this, to be able to do responsive research, is to have flexible funding. And I know that's a tough one. It's hard enough just to get funding, period, right? But to get flexible funding, like for operations costs, that's way more challenging. And so I'm going to provide a few tips that I've learned that have helped me. It may not be applicable to everyone's situation, but if even some of this is applicable, I hope that this is helpful to you. Because what I'm trying to do here, as you can see, is I'm trying to encourage people to do this kind of work, because I think it's extremely important, and we need more people to do this kind of work. So the first thing that I have found really useful in terms of requesting general operations support is to start local, because local foundations, local funders are more interested in supporting local work, right? You can imagine that they have a vested interest in a particular geographic area. So for these kinds of partnerships that are focusing on local school districts or a state education agency or anything along those lines, it is very helpful to start local. And the case has to be made, right, for supporting local work. And I think local foundations are often much more open to hearing or open to considering providing general operations support. But of course, in order to do that, this is not something that you do right away when you're developing a new relationship with a funder. This is something that can only happen after you have developed a long-term relationship. And I do mean long-term, like years and years and years of really working with foundations, local foundations, developing relationships of trust, and working with them to actually get ideas about what a partnership could and should look like, how it should be tweaked for the local context, and so forth. For some of the foundations that I mentioned earlier, I literally knew them and had relationships develop with them for probably 3-4 years before I asked them for money. So just to give you a sense of what I mean by long-term, just like having lots of conversations during that time before you get to this point of requesting general operations. Because usually, as you know, funders need to know exactly what they are funding and what the timeline is and what they're getting in return, right? And that's understandable. But general operations funding is basically saying you're asking for funds to be able to do whatever comes up. That's a very different request. And that's why I'm saying for that kind of a request, you really need to develop a long-term relationship. And you need to develop compelling deliverables. That is, just because you're not requesting project-specific support, it doesn't mean that you don't have to provide deliverables in the same way. In fact, it's even more important that you make it absolutely clear that you're producing something with this general support. So these deliverables could include things like, oh, we're generating a longitudinal database. We're generating a specific number of research briefs, or we're giving presentations to a certain number of presentations to these local stakeholders, including, of course, the funders. I give presentations to their boards, or presentations to folks that that are really interested in hearing about the kind of research that is going on, so that they can feel like, okay, we're supporting this organization and we see a very clear benefit to the community, very clear result, and it's clearly documented. All right, so you still have deliverables, and they have to be very, very compelling. You also have to mitigate risks. Obviously, this kind of request is a bit riskier for a funder, and it's very, very important to make really, really clear that you are that you're aware that there are risks and that you thought them through, and that you have taken steps to mitigate those risks, and you make that very clear. The last thing you should not do is what I'm trying to say. You should not pretend that there aren't any risks, and you shouldn't try to sugarcoat anything. Like, if you're very clear about how, okay, these are the risks and this is what we're doing to mitigate those risks, then the funders are much more likely to take you seriously and want to invest in your work. So one quick example is that in our case, a big risk is, of course, turnover. We're working with district partners where there is so much turnover that they want to know, okay, what will happen when there is turnover? Not if there's turnover, when there is turnover, and will this work continue? Will this work have to be interrupted? And now, of course, it's much easier for us to make that case because we can say we've been working with them for 10 years and we've gone through so many superintendents, we've gone through so many different boards and all that stuff. Like, I don't want to say we're not rattled by each turnover. We definitely have to take steps, but we've got experience now in dealing with massive turnovers. So, and then the last thing I'll mention is just building funder partnerships with each other. That is also a really helpful strategy. And actually, it's one of the strategies for mitigating risks. Like, it's less risky for funders if they can work jointly with each other to invest in a local partnership, and actually in those cases they can put in a little bit more money, and that makes the partnership a little bit more likely to be successful, and so it's kind of spreads out the risk, right, for any particular funder if they can work together to invest in organizations. So I've been involved in this a couple of times where I try to get funders to work together. I mean, often they have relationships anyway. They talk anyway, especially if they're investing in the same topic in the same geographic area. But it's just a matter of coordinating for the purposes of the research practice partnership work. So I'll stop there. Because I definitely want to leave time for questions, discussions, and any ideas that you all have that I have not mentioned. I also would love to hear. I'll stop the share so that I can see everybody, because I don't see as many faces when I have my slides up. There we go, and I can see more people.
Can I jump in with a question?
Absolutely. Hi, Dan.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for this. I think we all are feeling more inspired to do this kind of work. I'm just curious if you feel like there's any promise in the regional education lab system that the Department of Education has. Like, I feel like that's it's never really met its potential. Do you see it as a possibility, or is it kind of flawed from the beginning in your view? That's
a great question. I think it varies. like the actual, I'll get to the answer, the bottom line answer first, and then I'll explain a little bit. So I think the answer is yes. I think that is a potential model. It is a little bit different than what I just described. Some RELs, the regional education labs are sometimes called, some of the RELs are essentially made up of lots of RPPs. But there are some differences. For example, sometimes they work with contracts, like they'll accept contracts and do work for pay. We don't do that, and that's a really important difference. And I'm not saying they all do it this way, but in our case, we don't do contract work. We do not charge any of our district partners anything for any of this work, and that's very important to me, because now it has made my life much more difficult because I have a lot of fundraising to do. But I think that has played a significant role in the quality and tone of the partnership, because of the fact that we don't charge. If anything, like I said, we actually pay them so they can pay the salaries of our liaisons that are there. But I do think that there are some really promising aspects of RELs, that I love the fact that they receive funding from the federal government, and that can be really helpful for some of the things that I just described in terms of making sure that it's a long-term partnership, and making sure that they're set up to do responsive research as needed. That can only happen if you have a steady stream of funding that is not project specific, right? That's not tied to specific projects. So those kinds of things I think can be really helpful with the RELs, but there are some differences, as I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't realize they were contract based. I don't know a lot about them, but that's interesting. Thank you.
I don't know, to be fair to them, I don't know if all of them do that, but I know some of them do that. Yeah. Todd?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It's been very fascinating to hear, and an exciting partnerships to learn about. Prior to grad school, I'm currently a PhD student in education policy. Prior to grad school, I worked for the Kind Foundation, and in one of the education initiatives they supported, their sort of vision for long-term sustainability was that other funders would come along and support an initiative that they were sort of incubating. And I was wondering, in the work that you do, have funders sort of set out a vision for longer term sustainability where they either want to bring in other funders, or they expect that districts will eventually take on some of that support directly? And how do you sort of navigate that sort of long-term question around the sustainability, whether it's something that districts will build capacity in-house to do, or whether you envision it as a continual partnership?
That's a great question, Todd. Yes, I have in some cases been involved in fact, so a good example of this is our very first funder. Our very first funder gave us funding to kick off, to launch HERC, and they funded us for a couple of grant cycles after that. But then they made it very clear, like in the second grant cycle, they made it very clear that they were going to phase out, that their plan was that they're, like you said, incubators, and their plan was not to provide long-term funding. So at that point, we were very fortunate that we found other local funders to support our work, and as well as more national level funders. Now we do get project specific funding. I should have clarified that earlier. It's not that we don't get any project specific funding, but it's harder for us, given the type of work that we do, it's harder for us to know way in advance which projects we're going to work on, and early enough to be able to write up a proposal and get it funded and all that stuff. So, but we do that but most of our support is general operation support. And so we have to function more in the way that I described earlier. But yeah, so that's a tough one. In terms of long-term sustainability, I will say that we're doing a couple of things right now. Up to this point, we have not received direct funding from the university. So all of this has been through external support so far for the last 10 years. And every year I think, can I do this again? Can I do this again? How long can I possibly keep this up? But so far it has worked. And now I'm in the process of trying to get the university to have some more skin in the game. So that's the strategy that I'm pursuing right now, instead of what you mentioned. You mentioned the possibility of asking the districts for funding, and that may be a strategy in the future, but I want to put that off as long as I can. I'd rather hit up the university, which is, in my case, the university has a lot of resources. So I think that it's in their interest, actually. This is how I'm putting it to them, because I really believe this. It's in their interest to invest in this type of work. They use it all the time because it makes them look good, right? So I'm like, okay, well, no, maybe you can invest in it. But to be fair to them, they do provide our beautiful office space and they pay my salary. So I don't want to make it sound like they don't do anything, but they haven't been giving directly to HERC up to this point. Walter.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so many thoughts on this, but I wanted to dig into sort of the first pillar that you've given here, which is this like pre-existing partnerships. And it struck me that, not all partnerships are pre-existing. They had to start sometime. And I'm curious how with HERC you initially began the partnership with HISD, and then how it sort of seems to have kind of spread out into the surrounding districts as well. Because I feel like it's often, I think you mentioned this during your talk, university-based researchers, it seems to me like rarely have ties to the community that their university is based in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there may be this element of it from the district perspective, distrust in some way. So we'd love to hear more about how you went about building that relationship with HISD and then later with the surrounding districts as well.
Great question. So the hardest part for me was the original partnership with HISD. That was by far the most difficult because I was new in Houston. I didn't really have established relationships with folks locally, and I didn't have a track record locally. All of that I just had to start from scratch. What was extremely helpful is going back to Todd's question. What was extremely helpful was that I got the funding first. So I laid out the concept, developed it, all of that, got the funding first. The initial grant just for the startup was like $1.3 million. And I thought, okay, I can do something with this. So I used that to actually start HERC. And in other words, when I approached the district, I didn't show up empty-handed. Right? I showed up with, actually they came here first. They came to campus and was able to talk about this concept of partnership research. And it was a great first meeting with the superintendent at the time, Terry Greer. I don't know if you were left with Terry, but we overlapped, or excuse me, we had a great first meeting to really talk about what the partnership could look like. But I had resources to bring to the table that changed everything. They were like, oh yeah, absolutely, let's get something started. Now, but it was challenging at first before I got the funding, and when I was like, I don't know anybody, I'm new here, and I don't have a track record. But once HERC had been running for a few years and we did have a track record, then it became much, much easier. In fact, several of the surrounding districts initiated, they came to me and they asked, they invited themselves. They're like, can we be a part of this? And I was like, wow, like that's the last thing. I was super flattered, like super honored, because I remembered how hard it was to get it started. And now like people were asking if they could be a part of it. But I had to say, yes, but I have to get more funding. So, because I didn't want to just spread our resources thin and not be effective. So that took a lot more work in terms of securing much more funding. But then we were able to make the case for why this was needed at a regional level, and then it spread. I think we may have time for one more question, Beth.
Oh, sure. If anyone else has another question, I don't want to jump in and dominate the last question. All right, I'll go ahead. So yeah, just curious if you could talk a little bit about how you may have weathered the storm when there's been leadership transitions, you know, and just cases of, you know, when you may have had to present some challenging results that district partners weren't that excited to hear. If you could talk a little bit about that and sort of strategies for those things.
Sure, those are huge questions, but I'll give you the condensed version. For the first question about turnover, what has really helped us out is that we don't have a partnership with like one department or one area, but rather throughout the school district. So we have like for HISD, which is a huge school district with lots and lots of departments, we have set up strong working relationships throughout all the departments. So we primarily work with chief officers, but we also have relationships with lots of different departments. And that's important because then when there's turnover at like any particular department, or even if the superintendent, there's turnover at the superintendent level, it's okay because we have lots of relationships across the board. And so, and then we always rely on the other relationships to make sure that we get connected with wherever the new person is. So that's the key strategy, is like, don't, it's like when they say diversify your portfolio, that's what we do. Then for your second question about, what was your second question? I'm sorry.
Presenting results they don't want to hear.
Oh yeah, yes. And that happens all the time because it's not like things are all peachy and rosy and all that. So we have developed a kind of relationship that really, we want to make sure that they know that everything that we do is aiming to be constructive, always. We're not trying to embarrass anybody. We never do a gotcha moment. We're not, nothing. And everything is framed in that positive light, even if the findings are horrible, right? So there's one example where we did some assessment of a reading program that where the findings were horrible. And we were able to say, to frame it, is all true, right? We say, kudos to the school district for investing millions of dollars in trying to address, this struggling readers. They're trying to address struggling readers. They've invested millions of dollars in trying to help them. Also, kudos to the district for working with researchers to try to assess whether that was helping. We found that's not helping. But we're continuing to work on this. The district is continuing to work on this. So you see how, like, instead of saying, oh, the district is wasting millions of dollars on a program that doesn't work, we could have said that, but that's dumb. Like, that's not really, and people do that. I hate it when people do that. They're trying to make, districts look bad. And I'm like, look, they're trying to address a problem and they found out that their efforts didn't work, but like, kudos that they're trying to address the problem, they're taking it seriously, and that they're studying it with us, right? And now that it's not working, they're making all kinds of changes. So you can always frame horrible results in a positive, constructive way. And I think if all of us as researchers can do that well, I'm not saying you have to change your results, no, but you do have to frame it in a positive way, and that can go a long way.
Well, thank you so much. This is really inspiring, as others have already said. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to our speaker. And we look forward to lots of small group and one-on-one conversations later today.
Great. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.